Nobody saw the prince move. That is the sentence that will appear years from now in the opening paragraph of every serious account of the week that reshuffled the architecture of Middle Eastern power. Not the missiles, not the naval deployments, not the emergency sessions at the United Nations where ambassadors delivered carefully worded statements of grave concern that changed nothing and were designed to change nothing. The move that mattered happened in a room with no cameras, between two men whose governments had been publicly committed to mutual hostility for the better part of 5 decades, and it happened with a speed and a secrecy that the most well-resourced intelligence apparatus in human history failed to detect until the consequences were already irreversible. Saudi Arabia opened the Strait of Hormuz, not with warships, not with a military operation, not through the kind of coercive pressure that Washington had been applying for years with diminishing returns and increasing regional resentment. Saudi Arabia opened the strait the way that civilizational pivots actually happen, the way that history actually turns, not through the application of superior force, but through the exercise of something rarer and more durable and more dangerous to established power than any weapon system currently in any nation's inventory. Saudi Arabia opened the strait through an act of genuine strategic imagination that Washington could not replicate because Washington had spent 40 years building institutions, doctrines, and relationships specifically designed to make exactly this kind of regional realignment structurally impossible. And it worked. Before we go further, if this channel delivers the kind of strategic analysis that the people who manage the official narrative are working around the clock to get ahead of, subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments, did you see this coming? Because the honest answer for almost everyone sitting in the situation rooms and the intelligence fusion centers and the policy planning offices of the most powerful government on earth is that they did not. That answer has consequences. We are going to trace every single one of them. The story begins not with what Saudi Arabia did last week. It begins with what Saudi Arabia understood about its own position that Washington chronically refused to understand on its behalf. For the better part of a decade, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been living inside a strategic contradiction so profound and so structurally uncomfortable that its leadership has been unable to state it publicly without destabilizing the relationship architecture on which the kingdom's security formally depended. The contradiction is this: Saudi Arabia's primary security guarantor, the United States, is also the primary obstacle to the kind of regional stability that Saudi Arabia requires to execute the domestic transformation program, Vision 2030, the economic diversification away from oil dependency, that represents the only viable long-term future for the Saudi state. American pressure on Iran does not produce Iranian compliance. It produces Iranian capability development. Every sanction, every designation, every diplomatic isolation effort has not constrained Iran's military and strategic ambitions. It has concentrated them, focused them, and provided the ideological fuel that sustains the institutional commitment to asymmetric capability investment across generations of Iranian leadership. The Noor missile that closed the strait did not emerge despite American pressure on Iran. It emerged in significant part because of it. Saudi Arabia has watched this dynamic operate for 20 years with the attention of a government that understands it is caught between two forces that are using the space between them as a theater for a confrontation that Saudi Arabia did not choose and cannot afford. The Houthi missiles that have struck Saudi infrastructure, the regional proxy networks that have destabilized states on Saudi Arabia's periphery, the oil price volatility that makes long-term economic planning a structured exercise in managed uncertainty. All of it flows from a regional confrontation that American strategy has sustained and Iranian strategy has exploited, and Saudi Arabia has absorbed the costs of without the agency to reshape it. What changed was not Saudi Arabia's analysis of the problem. Saudi Arabia's analysis of the problem has been consistent and accurate for years. What changed was Saudi Arabia's assessment of the available solutions. And that assessment changed because of a single operational fact that transformed the strategic calculus in a way that no amount of diplomatic pressure or economic incentive could replicate. The strait was closed, the global economy was bleeding, and the United States could not open it. That last sentence is the one that restructured everything. Not that the United States would not open it, though the political constraints on American military escalation in the Gulf were real and getting more real by the hour as energy prices climbed and allied governments called Washington, asking questions that Washington did not have answers to. The devastating sentence was not would not, it was could not. The military instrument that American strategy had designated as the answer to exactly this scenario was on the floor of the strait, visible in the satellite imagery that every government on Earth was pulling with increasing urgency, and the operational planning for its replacement had not yet produced a credible timeline. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia looked at that fact, looked at the global economic consequences accumulating in real time, looked at the regional alignment dynamics shifting in directions that a prolonged strait closure would accelerate in ways deeply unfavorable to Saudi interests. Looked at China's position, strengthening by the hour as Beijing offered itself as the mediating power that could do what Washington demonstrably could not. And the Crown Prince made a decision. He picked up a communication channel that had been quietly maintained for 2 years, a channel that did not run through Washington, that was not CC'd to Langley, that did not appear in the diplomatic cable traffic that American intelligence services routinely monitor across the region, a channel that had been constructed patiently and deliberately for exactly the moment when its existence would need to be completely invisible to the parties whose interests it was designed to circumvent. He called Tehran. What was said in that conversation will not appear in any official record for years, possibly decades. What can be traced from the operational consequences that followed within 72 hours is the broad architecture of what was offered and what was accepted. Saudi Arabia offered Iran 3 things. The first was economic, not the lifting of American sanctions, which Riyadh cannot deliver unilaterally, but something arguably more immediately valuable: the commitment of Saudi financial and diplomatic capital to the construction of a regional economic framework that treats Iran as a participant rather than a pariah. Gulf Cooperation Council investment in Iranian infrastructure. Saudi facilitation of trade relationships that root around the sanctions architecture in ways that the letter of international law permits, even when the spirit of American policy opposes. Real money moving in real time into an Iranian economy that has been structurally starved of external capital for a generation. The second thing Saudi Arabia offered was political. Recognition in terms explicit enough to be operationally meaningful and ambiguous enough to be publicly deniable that Iran's position as a regional power with legitimate security interests is a permanent feature of the strategic landscape that Gulf Arab states are prepared to accommodate rather than contest. Not Iranian dominance, not the abandonment of Sunni Arab political identity, or the reversal of the positions that define Saudi Arabia's domestic political legitimacy. Accommodation, the recognition that 2 civilizational traditions with overlapping geographies and deeply rooted mutual suspicions can coexist within a regional framework that serves both better than the conflict has served either. The third thing Saudi Arabia offered was the one that Tehran had been waiting to hear stated explicitly by a credible interlocutor for the better part of 3 decades. It was the commitment made through a channel that both parties understood would never be publicly acknowledged by either, that Saudi Arabia would not facilitate or support or passively enable any American or Israeli military operation against Iranian territory conducted in retaliation for the strait closure or the carrier engagement, not active Saudi resistance to such an operation. The kingdom's relationship with Washington is not disposable, and both parties understood that. But the withdrawal of the passive facilitation, the overflight permissions, the intelligence sharing, the logistical access to regional infrastructure, the diplomatic cover in multilateral forums that has historically made American military operations in the Gulf viable in ways that pure American military capability alone could not sustain. Iran's calculation about the costs and risks of accepting that offer took less time than Washington would have expected. Because Iran's strategic establishment, whatever its public commitments to ideological purity and resistance, is staffed by people who can read a balance sheet. The strait closure had achieved its strategic objective. The carrier's destruction had demonstrated the capability that 30 years of development had built. The global economic pressure was real and was going to intensify in ways that affected Iranian interests alongside everyone else's. And the offer on the table represented a consolidation of the strategic gains that the engagement had produced, translated into durable economic and political outcomes, without the requirement to sustain a military confrontation whose next phase was genuinely unpredictable. Iran accepted. And within 72 hours of that acceptance, in a sequence of events whose coordination required the kind of operational security that made American intelligence look, in retrospect, like it had been reading the wrong map entirely, the Strait of Hormuz was open, not because Iranian forces stood down under American pressure, not because a naval coalition assembled by Washington created the military conditions for reopening, not because the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution that anyone was obligated to implement. The strait opened because Saudi Arabia and Iran, without American knowledge and without American participation, and in direct operational contradiction of the American regional strategy that had governed Gulf security arrangements for 4 decades, decided together that it should open. The silence from Washington in the hours after the strait reopened was not the silence of a government processing a positive development. It was the silence of an institution trying to locate itself in a strategic landscape that had been rearranged while it was focused on the wrong problem, because the strait opening was not the story. The strait opening was the visible surface event, the thing that the markets responded to and the news coverage led with, and the press briefings tried to frame as evidence that American diplomatic pressure was bearing fruit, an interpretation so disconnected from operational reality that the diplomats delivering it knew it was false while they were saying it. The story was what the strait opening revealed about the new architecture of regional power. The story was that Saudi Arabia had demonstrated a capacity for independent strategic action, conducted in direct contradiction of American preferences, that produced outcomes American strategy could not produce. Through relationships, American strategy had spent years trying to prevent Saudi Arabia from developing. The story was that the most important American ally in the Arab world had decided, in the most consequential regional crisis in a generation, that acting without Washington produced better results than acting with it, and had been right. That lesson does not stay in the Gulf. Strategic lessons of that clarity and that visibility do not stay anywhere. They travel. They are absorbed by governments in Ankara and Cairo and Islamabad and Jakarta that have their own versions of the contradiction that Saudi Arabia just resolved, their own calculations about the relative value of American alignment versus independent strategic agency, their own crown princes and foreign ministers sitting in rooms asking whether what just worked for Riyadh might work for them. The China dimension of this story has been underreported because Western media frames Chinese involvement in Gulf affairs through the lens of competition with the United States, which is accurate but incomplete. The more important frame is what China's role in the Saudi-Iranian normalization process, its prior mediation, its consistent positioning as an available alternative to American-led resolution, meant for the specific decision Saudi Arabia made when it reached for a communication channel to Tehran. Saudi Arabia reached for that channel with a confidence it would not have possessed 5 years ago. The confidence came partly from having watched China demonstrate through the earlier normalization process that deals between Gulf Arab states and Iran that bypassed American mediation were not only possible but durable. The template existed. The proof of concept had been established. Saudi Arabia's decision last week was not a leap into the unknown. It was the application of a tested model to a more extreme set of circumstances. Beijing's position in the aftermath is structurally superior to any position available to Washington. China did not do anything last week that it will have to apologize for or explain. It maintained its relationships with all parties. It was available as a framework and a precedent. It positioned itself as the kind of neutral, economically constructive, militarily non-threatening great power that a region exhausted by the costs of American-Iranian confrontation finds increasingly attractive as a patron. Washington's position is the inverse of all of that. It must explain to Gulf partners why its military guarantee proved insufficient. It must explain to domestic audiences why the most expensive military in human history could not keep a strategically critical waterway open. It must explain to allied governments in Europe and Asia, whose economies were damaged by the strait closure, why the American-led regional order that those allies fund through defense spending and diplomatic solidarity failed its most visible test. And it must do all of that explaining while absorbing the strategic reality that its most important Arab ally resolved the crisis through exactly the kind of independent regional diplomacy that American policy has spent decades discouraging. The hardest conversation happening in Washington right now is not about Iran. It is about Saudi Arabia. It is about what it means when a partner state with deep historical ties and genuine ongoing convergent interests with the United States makes a strategic decision of this magnitude without consultation, without notification, without the courtesy of advance warning that would have allowed American policy to at least claim that it was informed. The decision to not tell Washington was not an oversight. It was an operational requirement. Saudi Arabia understood that any American awareness of the initiative would produce American pressure to halt it, and Saudi Arabia was not prepared to halt it, and therefore American awareness had to be prevented. That is the sentence that will keep American foreign policy professionals awake for years. A key ally concluded that the United States was an obstacle to the resolution of a crisis and acted accordingly. The global energy markets that screamed upward when the strait closed have begun their descent. The insurance suspensions that froze commercial shipping are being lifted. The tankers that were holding position outside the engagement zone are beginning to move. The visible economic emergency is receding with a speed that will allow governments to frame the resolution as a success for the international community, for diplomacy, for the resilience of global energy markets. All of those framings are technically accurate, and all of them are strategically hollow. What actually resolved the crisis was not the international community. It was a bilateral conversation between two governments that have officially considered each other enemies for 50 years, facilitated by no multilateral institution, endorsed by no Security Council resolution, and conducted in a deliberate operational security posture designed to exclude the most powerful government on earth from participation. The strait is open, the ships are moving, the oil is flowing, the markets are stabilizing. And the world that exists on the other side of this week is not the world that existed before it. Every security relationship in the region is being quietly repriced based on the information that this week produced. Every government that had calibrated its strategic positioning on the assumption that American power defined the outer limits of what was achievable in the Gulf is recalculating. Every actor that had accepted the constraints of American-defined regional order as structural features of reality rather than contingent arrangements that a sufficiently capable and sufficiently imaginative regional power could circumvent is revising that acceptance. The Strait of Hormuz is open. But the strategic order that governed who got to open it and how and on whose terms is not the order that existed before the Crown Prince made a phone call that nobody in Washington knew was coming. Saudi Arabia did not just open a waterway. It opened a question. The question is whether the regional order of the next 40 years will be organized around American power the way the last 40 years were, or whether what happened this week represents the first clear operational proof that an alternative architecture is not only possible but already partially built. Nobody in Washington has a good answer to that question tonight. The people who most need to answer it are still trying to find the room where the answer went wrong.